You're listening to the Modern Mainframe, BMC's Intelligent Z Optimization and Transformation podcast, covering the latest trends and issues in mainframe DevOps, data, operations, security, and cloud. You've never mainframed like this. Hello there. Welcome to the Modern Mainframe. I'm Matt Delaire. Today we're talking about mainframe cost optimization, how to understand what's driving consumption, use history to separate one-off spikes from system issues, and make safer decisions about change. Joining me for the discussion are BMC Principal Product Manager Glenn Everitt and Technology Solutions Director Jeremy Hamilton. Glenn, Jeremy, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Matt.
Hey, thanks for having us.
So, Jeremy, I'll start with you. What should mainframe teams look at when trying to confidently cut costs?
Yeah, I like to term it more as cost optimization instead of cuts. And, that's really because of course, you want to get the most out of your mainframe dollar. That's the goal. And especially these days, people are looking at those costs and they're rising. So how can you get the most out of what you're spending? But not at the expense of the reliability and performance that the business requires. If you cut costs too much, then you really risk the revenue generating applications that your business relies on. So if I'm on a mainframe team, the first thing that I would want to do is really understand what's driving those costs. And that's the first step, because 9 times out of 10, I've worked with customers and it wasn't what they think. Yeah, they might know their nightly batch processing is the largest peak in their system, or maybe consumes the most MSU hours. But what's the combination of workloads that are really pushing that up? What applications make those workloads up? And are there any opportunities for optimizing or spreading out the workloads? So, I like most things. I tell customers, I tell my friends that are in the mainframe world, getting your arms around what it is you're dealing with is the first step. And that old adage, if you can't improve anything, you don't measure. And so that's what I would say the first step would be.
And I think that's an interesting point you bring up, the very first point there about, you don't want to optimize so much that you're moving the costs off of spending money on mainframe and increasing your team costs. It's not savings if you're pushing more work onto your team or slowing them down, because that's not cost savings at all. That's just transferring costs from one place to another and probably making it actually even worse. So I think that's an excellent point. And your other comment about it's never necessarily where you think it's going to be. In fact, one of the things we've kind of done with customers a lot of times is when you see them raise their eyebrows or they point to something and say, "What's that?" That's a very good indicator that that's something you need to investigate. And that may be that surprise expense that's been sitting there for maybe a couple of weeks that no one noticed since you pushed that last batch of code or whatever. So, it's an excellent point that, you look for those surprises because they're not necessarily the things you look at all the time, again, because you look at those things all the time. So I think that's an excellent point.
When I do cost analysis of customers' environments, that's the very first thing I look at. How much low importance workload is contributing to what they're paying? And I've seen it as high as 80% of their peak utilization if they're on
Wow.
R4, or even their MSU hours, is being driven by low importance workload. That's stuff that doesn't need to run right then or could be spread
Hmm.
out, and
Hmm.
that's just one of those gotcha moments.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting.
So, Glenn, what's pressuring teams to cut costs, and why is that pressure growing now?
Well, this growth, mainframe usage growth has been driven by a lot of different things over the years. Initially, way back when there was a banking consolidation. So suddenly we had a lot more banks getting put on fewer mainframes because the banking industry was consolidating because of all the turmoil there. And then kind of the next thing that happened is there were the invention of REST APIs, and we figured out how to have REST APIs driven onto the mainframe. So everyone wanted that system of record information off the mainframe, and they wanted it for the distributed systems so that we didn't have to copy data all over the place anymore. So that was another thing. And then the next thing that happened after that was kind of the mobile revolution where that started driving a bunch more traffic. And after we had that mobile traffic come along, then the next thing that happened is we have COVID, and COVID is driving everyone online. No one is going out shopping in person anymore. Everyone is doing things online. So that drove even more transactions onto the mainframe. And I think the next wave of that is going to be AIs are going to start wanting that information, that system of record information, and they're going to start driving a lot more traffic onto the mainframe. So every time we have more automation and more distributed access to the platform, it seems like that increases the amount of traffic that gets driven onto the platform. And I don't think that's going to stop. Again, because it's valuable data, because it is the data that everyone trusts. So everyone wants to go to that as the source. So I don't think the growth is ever going to stop. It may move around a little bit, but it's not going to stop.
Yeah, the cost pressure pieces, I'm going to go a little more rudimentary. A lot of the executives today didn't grow up on the mainframe. They didn't grow up around the mainframe. They came from the distributed and cloud world. And, there for a while, there was this huge pressure to get everything off the mainframe. And now they're coming to the realization that, it's a modern platform. It's going to be here for a long time, but it's still the largest line item in their IT budget. And anytime any executive I've ever known looks at the budget and sees one line item that's, 5, 6 times bigger than the other line
Yeah.
items, they're going to say, let's cut 10% off of that. And not realizing really what the platform is doing or why that the costs are so high on there.
Yeah, the other thing is there's simply, as far as I can tell, I've never seen anything that does transaction processing as well as the mainframe. There have been different things in the distributed world that have tried to do transaction processing, but none of them are as successful, as stable, as performant as they are on the mainframe. So, as far as I can tell, there's just no substitute for the stuff that comes in from a transaction processing point of view. And again, that, as you said, Jeremy, that's one of those big drivers. And the other aspect of that online aspect that causes us problems is that competes with our batch load. So there's always batch work that has to get done. A lot of times there's regulatory things that drive that. And, that ends up competing with the online traffic. And you want to provide, great response time to your people that are actively on your systems trying to do stuff. So there's that battle between that increasing online load and the batch stuff that you got to keep going to keep the lights on in your place.
Jeremy, we touched on some of these already, I think, but when costs jump unexpectedly, what are the usual suspects? Which are the hardest to prove quickly and to find?
Yeah. So if you're a cost person or a capacity planning person and you come in every single day, the first question you want to ask is what changed? What changed overnight? What changed from last week? What changed from last month? And, typically, I would say most customers kind of know how things will perform on Monday versus how they'll perform on a Friday. And if they're out of normal, that's where they get interested. That's where they need to start, investigating what happened. Who's driving this change? What type of change happened upstream or downstream that is impacting my cost and even my reliability with capacity. And so, where's the usual suspects? I don't want to throw the ball over the fence too much, but usually it's a change that's made off the platform that now is driving additional
Yeah.
started task, additional transactions on the platform that weren't anticipated. This is a really quick example. I was working with a large aircraft company, and they teamed up with a large coffee company. And they said, okay, well, if someone buys a cup of coffee, then they get a couple of extra airline miles. Great. Sounds like a wonderful marketing campaign. The problem is they didn't tell the mainframe team that they were doing it, and they accessed an API. So yeah, now the API that was intended to run a few hundred times, in a minute, is now running a few thousand times a minute, and it spiked their workloads, spiked what they're consuming, and really ramped up their costs. So, a lot of times it's not even on the platform that can be those usual suspect.
So, how do teams gain visibility into what's actually causing it?
Well, I always look at the comparison. Jeremy brought this up earlier, and this is something that we see in our product all the time is that people are looking at today and then they say, what did it look like last week on Monday? What did it look 2 weeks ago on Tuesday? It's always that the initial thing to do is always look and compare to something that you think was normal. So if I can find that normal thing and I can compare what the shape of my current graph is, that might give me a really good idea of where to start. But again, visibility, you gotta kinda look in the right place. Is it a CPU problem that you're looking at, or is it a memory problem you're looking at? And again, it's not always necessarily clear what the ultimate driver is. We've seen cases where, not having enough low-level memory can drive CPU problems because it stacks up workload in the system. You've got a lot of things that get initiated into the system, and they're all trying to do something at the same time, but you don't none of them are gonna be able to make much forward progress because they all hit this out of memory thing. So, it can drive the system into the ground just because, one resource that you don't really anticipate running out of is causing you that problem.
Yeah, I mean that really really highlights the hand in hand or dichotomy between cost and capacity. Applications consume resources. That's what they're built to do. They're consuming resources on DB2, they're consuming resources on CICS, they're consuming storage. That's what they have to do to function, but resources cost money. So, as Glenn said, how things looked Monday, how they looked 2 weeks ago on Monday, how they look every Monday, understanding what that is supposed to look like, and then being able to infer and get actionable insight for what does it look like right now that we realize there's a problem. Maybe it's too low. Why are my workloads too low? And getting to that why of what's driving your resource utilization and ultimately what's driving your dollars, is really getting over the chasm, so to speak.
That's an interesting point, and I think this points out the value of that historical data. We do a lot with monitors, obviously, at BMC also, but monitors are good in the minute to hour. They don't really provide that true historic view, that goes back, weeks, months, years. That's not really what a monitor is for, but that's what a capacity, management product does. It allows you to see that trend of growth over a much longer period of time, and so again, it always is able to provide that historic perspective that you just don't get from the other, products in your
Right.
portfolio.
Once you have that visibility into what's driving the costs, how can you turn that into action?
So there's a couple different ways of doing that. Ultimately, you need to get down to changing it from a system point of view. Generally, you need to change that into an application type perspective and understand what application is actually driving that. So you need to first off be able to understand what applications are driving that. And again, that application a lot of times, Jeremy brought this up before, you know, it often has, a combination of batch and online and databases. And so, you kind of need to, once you get down past the which application is it, you can start looking at what subsystems that it's ultimately using. That's when you start getting close to being able to look at that. And that's why, these products look at so many different metrics. You can analyze a lot of different metrics, and that's the thing that's going to help you start to pinpoint where the issue is. And again, dashboards can help you with this by, if you've got a dashboard for your memory, your storage, and, for example, even your coupling facility or other things that are on the mainframe. those are the things that you can start to look at and start to see if those are out of range. Again, from that historical data that you've got, it gives you a good idea of where you can start looking. And then once you've identified the particular application, then there's other tools. Now, once you've identified that application, you can start using a SQL statement analyzer to start looking for the statements that are causing problems if you've determined it's sitting in the DB2 subsystem. Or you could use a product like Strobe to look at a particular customer application program to see what parts of the code in there are maybe not performing well. So once you've identified the application, it really gets you that helps you select the tool to do the actual deep dive to get down to the either the line of code or the SQL statement that needs fixed. Or if it's a subsystem configuration problem, that's the other area that happens a lot where someone has gone in and monkeyed with something that they didn't really understand and they've configured it wrong, either too restrictively or just plain wrong. So there's a lot of different avenues to doing that exploration, but that first step is figuring out what application is the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd say mainframers are pretty crafty. Once they know that their particular application or their part of the puzzle is the problem, then they go to work right away and can solve the problem. And so visibility really is key. One customer I'm working with, they quote this, don't use it my word, but the naughty list or the top 10 applications across the entire environment that are costing the company the most. Now, if you think about it, if week after week your application is number one on that list, you're going to start finding ways to optimize. Maybe it's shifting workloads around. Maybe it's looking at the database calls that are occurring. Whatever it may be, you're going to say, I want off the naughty list. And so yeah, it's just a fun way that customer is approaching it to drive change.
How can forecasting help with that?
Yeah, well, nobody can really predict the future. Otherwise, I would, be picking the right lottery numbers, right? But forecasting and even what if planning helps you to understand, okay, well, what am I anticipating that's coming my way? So if you anticipate a particular workload or application is going to grow by 10%, then what does that mean? Are there costs that I should be planning for today? Are there changes that I can make in my environment today that's going to help me with whatever that new aspect that's coming down the pipe is going to hit? So, playing around with what if? What if I split this into two LPARs? What if I scheduled this batch application a couple of hours earlier so that it can complete a little closer to the SLA based on the growth of the workloads. What if, and having the option to do that, that gives you that intelligence to make the right decisions and confident decisions. Without it, then you're really kind of hoping and making educated guesses. But this really helps you to make informed, data driven decisions.
Yeah, the other question I always say is, when do I run out of? And fill in the blank, right? When do I run out of memory? When do I run out of CPU? When do I run out of storage? Those are a lot of the questions when I look at a, capacity planning product. Those are kind of the questions I always think. And that's, I think, where forecasting really shows a real strength is, you don't want to be in a situation, a really bad situation where you simply don't have the system capacity to get done what you need to get done. So being able to have a look at your system and see what that growth trajectory is and see what the trend line of growth is, that will, give you an idea of when I need to pick up that more memory or when do I need to upgrade my system or, do I delay that marketing campaign for my coffee so that I'm not creating another, 1,000 transactions a second on a platform that's already stressed. So again, having that an idea And again, all these forecasting, all those statistical methods completely rely on having enough history to actually compute something that's helpful. So again, it goes back to having that historical data that you've been collecting and managing. And that's the other aspect of kind of these kinds of things is just managing that amount of data can be problematic. So tooling can help with kind of that managing of the amount of historical data you want to keep too.
What can DevOps teams do to understand the downstream impact that their code changes might have on cost and capacity?
Yeah, well, that is something that's been fastly growing within a lot of shops that I'm working with, the ones that have gone to DevOps. So if you think about it, DevOps' whole purpose is to increase the rate of change and being able to put changes into production. That's where you start getting the value. The problem is that's the systems programmer, capacity planner, cost manager's worst nightmare because they want it stable and they want, it says something that's predictable. So what I'm starting to see is organizations are making a seat at the table for cost and capacity planning with the DevOps teams, letting them set in on the meetings, understand the type of changes that are coming down from DevOps, and start to model. What does that mean for cost? What does that mean for capacity? What additional capacity do I need in order to handle these changes? Because before, when they were isolated and they didn't have that type of role within the DevOps team, then it was, hey, let's make this change and they'll worry about it, once it gets to production. Now with the capacity planners in the room, they can put the brakes on and say, wait a second, and before you do this problem, we need to, add additional storage. We need to, increase our caps, whatever the need may be. But now they at least have that knowledge. So the key is though is to have a tool and to have a dialogue that both sides can understand. The programmers probably don't understand MIPS and MSUs that well. Whereas a capacity planner, they understand, the CPU and the storage utilization, those type of numbers. So the vernacular that has worked the best that I've seen is cost. DevOps teams understand cost and capacity teams understand cost. And now you have a unified language that you can both talk to.
One of the things that we've been kind of looking at from a capacity planning tool is a way to put myself in the context of what my environment is. Looking at a bunch of charts doesn't tell me when that next release is, to your point, Jeremy. So being able to have a way to allow us to visualize when that event happened lets us have context in the chart that we're looking at as a capacity planner. So now, if I know that we released stuff this last Sunday, I can go and I can compare. Like I said, we always compare things. I can compare stuff on this Monday morning after that software release to last Monday and see how my baselines have changed. And those baselines are kind of what I want to make sure I understand because those are the things that are going to drive how I make decisions and what I need to do resource upgrades and make sure I've got enough capacity because those baseline changes are what are going to influence, how my future performance is on this system that I'm trying to manage. So again, that context with being able to have the context of machine upgrades, of turning CPUs on or off, that big software release, that new marketing campaign, even if I can have the context of that and being able to know exactly where that's at and show that on my charts when that happened, then I can look at my curves before that and I can look at the curves on the chart after that and see what impact that had. And that's incredibly valuable information. And that's something that I don't think the tools in this area have done traditionally a very good job at. But now that it's not just sitting at the table, but it's seeing that reflected in the data right in front of me while I'm trying to understand my load.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, there for a while, SRE teams were growing, pretty rapidly. And one of the things I like about the SRE approach is it's self-governing, meaning, the DevOps teams can make all the changes they want until they break things too much and you have an error
Yeah,
budget, right? The error budget, whenever you get through your error budget, then they slam on the brakes and say, hey, we need to fix the problems we had first before there's more changes that come down. So if the DevOps teams want to keep pushing out changes, then they better push out better code. In a similar fashion, having a capacity planner involved with these conversations allows you to do that. Once you hit the top of your box, there's no more box unless you want to turn on engines, which
right.
the cost tons of money. So they are able to put on the brakes and really have that discussion, like Glenn was saying, that everyone can understand and relate to.
Well, and the interesting thing I think is that your system programmers, they understand, I can talk to them about coupling facility metrics or memory metrics, whatever. They have the mindset to understand a lot of different metrics. But when you start talking to business people and you start talking about, EXCP rates and stuff like that, they kind of just glaze over. But if you start talking about, well, this new transaction that you just rolled out is going to cost you $10,000 per day to keep that running, you get a lot different response than if you're talking about EXCP rates to your business people. So it's really nice to be able to talk both in terms of dollars and cents and in terms of the metrics because they're both talking about the same thing, but they're a different perspective, and that perspective is useful for talking to the two different audiences that you're going to talk to when you're looking at capacity planning efforts.
Yeah, yeah. One of the framers I love working with. He's the stereotypical systems programmer that the a little gruff and they don't mince words. And he was telling me a story about once. An executive was trying to force them to accept more changes on the platform, and he was able to bring up the charts that showed, okay, yeah, we can do that, but it's going to double your IT budget. Are you willing to do that? And it leveled the playing field. Now they had data to back their assumptions and their honestly their knowledge about the platform.
Mhm. Yeah, it changes the meat of the conversation pretty substantially.
So, Glenn, with the rise of AI and recent advancements, how does that affect cost and capacity?
Well, the BMC product line has used machine learning in the capacity reporting product for many years at this point. And what we do with it is we use that to determine what normal is in your environment. So normal in your environment changes over time, and that's one of the advantages that a machine learning approach can take. It looks and it computes a norm for your system, but it can detect automatically when your system is out of normal. So it's like having someone who sits there in front of your system day in and day out and notes not only when you're approaching thresholds, but it knows enough to change those thresholds so it's not bugging you when something unimportant happens. So that's kind of the beauty of the machine learning approach that we've put into the product. Now, there's other, obviously right now there's a lot of excitement around the new large language models, and a lot of that is useful. We've recently integrated some of that into the capacity reporting product. We allow you to ask questions about the product and understand what the product can do for you by using a chat interface. So that chat interface lets you ask questions about the product and understand how to use it more effectively. And we think that was a great first step for us in the large language model type of AI that everyone is experimenting with at this point.
Yeah, that's huge because I mean, you think about it, capacity planners don't grow on trees. And what I when I first started on the platform, gosh, almost 20 years ago now, the capacity planning folks were, in their 50s, but now they're in their 70s. And this new generation that may have, educational knowledge, they may have some experience working firsthand, but they don't have the season, tenure that some of those capacity planners did in the past. So having a tool that A, they can interact with and get value from, but also B, interact with and ask questions and to understand what certain metrics and data mean, that's immensely valuable for this new generation that's coming in. And I've been a little bit surprised at the number of organizations that are now turning to capacity planning and building their capacity planning staff back up. There for a while, it kind of went down, and then within the last 3 or 4 years, I've seen a big uptick for capacity planning.
You're right, Jeremy. And what's interesting to me about that is some of these places had homegrown systems in place and they had several capacity planners who knew how to operate that and kept it going. And what we're seeing now is that they're wanting to replace those homegrown systems with a more commercial product because they don't want to have to maintain that. And they think it's easier to train that next generation on those. The other thing that I've noticed, well, that I talk to customers about when they're looking at the product, is I tell them, the level of automation that we can provide you in terms of the data management of the historical data and all that is much greater than you'll ever be able to do on your own because you can't amortize the cost of doing that kind of work across, hundreds of customers like we can. So there's definitely advantages to being able to use a commercial product with a lot of the automation built in for the data management and the automatic dashboards and the alerting analysis that we've built into the product. And again, back to your point about, the new people have a lot to learn. One of the things that's built into the capacity product that we've got is this concept of a workflow. And the workflow is really a workflow of analysis. So it takes you kind of step by step through analysis of a particular thing. I've talked about coupling facility a couple times already today, and we do have a workflow that's specific to the workflow coupling facility. And it guides you through the analysis of looking at a coupling facility. And again, that's something that your typical capacity planner is not going to have a lot of experience with, but it is something that if you don't have adequate resources in that area, it can cause your whole plex to seize up and not be able to process work. So being able to have these predefined workflows in the product makes it much easier for these new people to come in and start to understand the process of doing that analysis and the kinds of metrics that would be interesting. The kind of the other aspect of that is, your experienced people, they can take these and use them as templates and change them in a way that tailors it more closely to what specific metrics are affected on your platform or extend them in any way they really need to. So having that flexibility both ways provides a wonderful set of tools that can be shared across your new people and make them a lot more efficient than they otherwise would be.
Okay, well, we're getting near the end here. Jeremy, do you have any parting thoughts?
I would say, just to kind of sum it all up and come back around, the relationship between cost and capacity isn't new. Yeah, it's been around since the very first IT system was built. What is new is what is out there to give you the visibility and to understand what the drivers truly are. Our systems have gotten way more complex with way more people involved and way more avenues that can impact both cost and capacity. But the equation has remained roughly the same. And what I encourage everyone that's listening today is to really start with the visibility aspect, but it's not all about the visibility. You need to know the why behind what you're seeing, the why behind what's driving your workloads up, the why behind why the resources are being consumed in order to start optimizing what you're spending on the platform and optimizing how your platform is performing.
Glenn?
Well, one of the thoughts, we've been talking about in the lab quite a bit lately is sharing this capacity data to a wider audience. And those are the rest of the operations people. Capacity and problems you may have around capacity are useful for your operations staff to understand too, from the perspective of, is this a recurring problem? And again, the capacity product probably has that historical data that give you that history back of whether this is a recurring problem. Or is this a growth problem? We finally hit a threshold from which we're not going to recover without additional resources. Again, that's useful for an operator to know, because then they know that sometimes operations can make things worse by trying to fix a problem that can't be fixed. So having that additional context from the capacity world can actually help your operations people make better decisions about ways that they can attempt to fix a problem that's an immediate and something that really needs taken care of in the moment, rather than doing it blindly and maybe doing something that's less than optimal.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I got one more. Sorry. You know me. I always got to chime in.
That's good.
You keyed on a piece there that I think is very important to point out. Mainframe workloads are growing. We've seen it in our mainframe survey. We've seen it in a lot of different metrics that are out there. But growing just for the sake of growing, it may not be adding any additional value to your system. May not be getting more users on the system, or more clients, or more transactions from or value generating transactions. So having a cost and capacity solution allows you to look at your growth and understand where that growth is coming from, and is it growth because the business is growing, everything's great, or is it just because of inefficiencies that could be popping up in the platform? And that's a very valuable piece to keep in mind.
We've been calling that good growth versus bad growth. And we kind of label good growth as growth that's driven by business expansion, right? More accounts receivable transactions, right? That's a good thing. More overhead reporting regulation type of workload is not necessarily a good thing. It doesn't drive anything good to your business. It's just work that's has to get done, or maybe it doesn't have to get done, or maybe it doesn't have to get done when you're currently doing it, and you can free those resources up for something else at this moment, or push that off platform. Is that something that could be reported on a distributed platform rather than burning up your valuable transaction processing resources on the mainframe? So I think that's an excellent point, Jeremy, that good growth versus bad growth. And, that bad growth, is there some way to shift that so it's less painful?
Well, this has been a great conversation. Jeremy, Glenn, thanks for being here. Thanks for taking part.
Well, thanks, Matt. Appreciate the opportunity. And Jeremy, always a pleasure.
Same to you, Glenn, and thanks a lot, Matt. I really enjoy your podcast series, and looking forward to working on a couple more in the future.
Great. So am I. Glad to hear it. And thank you to our listeners. I'll include some links in the show notes to a recent tech talk we had on optimizing mainframe cost and capacity with BMC AMI Ops, an online demo you can explore, and a recent blog post on the subject. So take care, and we'll talk to you next time on the Modern Mainframe. You're listening to the Modern Mainframe, BMC's Intelligent-Z Optimization and Transformation podcast, covering the latest trends and issues in mainframe DevOps, data, operations, security, and cloud. You've never mainframed like this.